Guardians of the Dead by Frederick Cowles and read by Christopher Halton. Frederick Cowles had a particular talent for taking an old legend, an isolated place, and a seemingly harmless curiosity, and allowing them to lead his characters somewhere they really ought not to go. In Guardians of the Dead, that journey takes us into the remote Pyrenees, to a hidden people and a secret that has been preserved for centuries. It is a tale of ancient beliefs, forbidden places, and the considerable danger of ignoring a warning simply because you don't believe it. So settle back as we enter the caves and discover The Guardians of the Dead by Frederick Cowles. Jim Newman and his friend Gilbert Brown pored eagerly over the faded pages of the old manuscript. "Where did you find it?" asked Gilbert. "It was in the back of one of the drawers in the bureau that belonged to my grandfather," was the reply. "Evidently he wrote it and put it there for safety." "Do you think there is anything in the story?" "Well, my grandfather was a great traveller, an authority on folklore and mythology, and it is unlikely that he would go to the trouble of making a record of anything that was untrue." "Read it through again," begged Gilbert. Jim sat back in his chair and, after lighting a cigarette, began to read from the crumpled pages. "In the summer of 1852, I, Henry Newman, spent 3 months in Spain and southern France, endeavouring to study the traditions and folklore of the gypsies. At Pau, I heard rumours of a Romany tribe who were said to live in caves in a rocky valley of the Pyrenees, about 50 miles away. I was informed that these people were very superior to the ordinary gypsies, both physically and mentally. Naturally, my interest was aroused, and I set out to discover the retreat of these people. Unfortunately, I lost my way in the mountains, and after wandering about for 3 days, found myself so exhausted that I was unable to go a step more. I took shelter under a ledge of rock, and there awaited either death or a rescuer. It was the rescuer who came. He was a tall, lithe young man with features not unlike those of a South American Indian, and yet with the look of a gypsy about him. He was quick to realize my plight and supplied me with cake and wine. We spoke in Spanish, and he told me that he came from the city of caves. I tried him in Romany, of which language I have a fair knowledge. The result was surprising. He immediately threw his arms about me, called me brother, and offered me the hospitality of his tribe. I was too weak to walk, but this amazing young fellow hoisted me onto his shoulders without any effort and must have carried me for about 4 miles. Then we arrived at a narrow defile in the mountains, and 2 men, obviously guards, challenged us. My companion spoke with them, and we were permitted to pass. How shall I write of the wonders of that secluded valley, and of the kindly people I found there? They were certainly gypsies, but of a higher mentality than any gypsies I had ever met. They lived in caves, and their homes were clean and even luxurious. Well-woven carpets covered the floors, cushioned divans gave an air of oriental comfort, and there were treasures of native workmanship that would have made any art collector's mouth water. The men were of fine physique, skilled in all manner of crafts, and the women were the loveliest I have ever seen. For over a month I enjoyed the hospitality of this strange race, studying their customs and their mode of life. There was nothing secretive about them, and I easily obtained all the information I wanted. Manuel, my rescuer, was most helpful. He told me that the tribe were the original people of Zind, doomed to be exiles until the great god of their race was born into the world. On the day before I left, Manuel offered to show me the caves of the dead. Here, according to his story, all the rulers of his tribe from age immemorial sat in state awaiting the day when the god should come again. "Lay not a finger upon them, my brother," he warned me, "for the guardians of the dead are swift to avenge any desecration. Their power is terrible, and they can strike at a distance, even to the four corners of the earth. My guide conducted me some distance along the valley to where a clump of tamarisk trees hid the entrance to a large cave, or rather, as I was to discover, a series of caves. Manuel lit a torch, and together we entered the gloomy cavern. The first thing I noticed, after my eyes had become accustomed to the semi-darkness, was the figure of a man reclining in a recess near the entrance. He seemed to be sleeping, and then I saw, on the other side, another person resting in a similar attitude. "These are the guardians of the dead," whispered Manuel. "For over 1,000 years they have watched over the great ones who await the coming of the god." I inspected the figures closely and found them to be bodies preserved in some remarkable manner. We went farther into the caves, and after about 200 yards, recesses were cut on either side, and in each recess sat a robed figure. Manuel explained to me that the kings were on the right and the queens on the left. All the bodies were preserved so cleverly that they appeared to be alive. Here and there were images of wood instead of bodies, and these images held caskets on their knees. "These," explained my guide, "are the figures of those rulers of my race who in the old days were burned for witchcraft. The caskets contain their ashes, carefully gathered up from the foot of the stake." The wonders of that abode of the dead almost took my breath away. Most of the bodies wore golden crowns on their heads and marvellous rings on their fingers. Many of these pieces of regalia were worthy of a place in any museum, and must have been worth thousands of pounds. For nearly 2 hours we wandered around that awful place, and the eyes of the dead seemed to follow us wherever we went. I was very relieved when we went out into the sunlight again. On the way back to the camp, Manuel told me many stories of the vengeance that had overtaken rash people who had attempted to desecrate that great tomb. "However far they fled, the guardians of the dead have overtaken them," he said, "and their punishment has been terrible." The next morning I left the city of caves and made my way back to Pau. You who read this record may be tempted to seek out the place for yourself, but let me seriously warn you not to attempt to interfere in any way with those who await rebirth. I'm convinced that the power of the guardians of the dead is something beyond our comprehension, something too terrible and mysterious to be understood. "And now what do you think of that for a tale?" asked Jim. "I think it is too good to be missed, and I suggest that we go over to Spain as soon as possible," answered Gilbert. 3 weeks later the friends landed at San Sebastian and at once made their way to Pau, on the French side of the Pyrenees. There they made careful and discreet inquiries and discovered that a gypsy tribe still lived in the mountains, but were regarded with superstitious dread by the natives of the district. "They are spirit people," said one old man, "and it is not good to have dealings with them." Such warnings only made Jim and Gilbert more eager to see this strange race for themselves, and they set off from Pau with a thrill of high adventure in their hearts. It was nearly a week before they found the valley they were seeking, and then the guards would not allow them to pass into it. Jim, who had some knowledge of the Romani language, pleaded to be admitted and told them that his grandfather had enjoyed the hospitality of the tribe in 1852. All the men would promise was that a message should be sent to their king. With this, the friends had to be content, and they set up their camp under the shadow of a cliff. Next day a messenger arrived with the necessary permission, and the Englishmen were conducted to the city of caves. They were received by the ruler of the tribe, a stately old man who, to their surprise, informed them that his name was Manuel, and that he was the man who had rescued Jim's grandfather. "But," exclaimed Gilbert, "that was over 80 years ago." "Yes," was the answer, 81 years ago to be exact. I am 104 years old. "All I can say," gasped Jim, "is that you don't look that." The old fellow chuckled in his beard. "It is no great age for one of my race," he replied. "My father lived to be 135. He died only 2 years ago." For 3 days the friends explored the city of caves and were amazed at the things they saw. Then Jim asked Manuel if they were to be allowed to see the caves of the dead. The permission was rather grudgingly given, and the old man warned them earnestly against doing anything to incur the wrath of those who guarded the dead. Early the next morning, accompanied by Iago, the grandson of the old chief, they set out on their expedition. Their guide carried a powerful electric torch, and Jim and Gilbert could not help but comment upon the contrast between this source of illumination and that used when Jim's grandfather was conducted over the caves. They found the caverns exactly as the record had stated. They stood awe-stricken before the figures of the guardians who, for over 1,000 years, had borne the semblance of life. "They sleep," said Iago, "but they awaken quickly if any foolish person dares to violate the sanctity of this place." Half fearfully they wandered along the dark caverns where the rulers of this forgotten race sat in royal state. Every now and again they stopped to examine some gem, or a rare treasure of the goldsmith's art, adorning the body of a long-dead king or queen. At the 8th queen, Gilbert suddenly gripped Jim's arm. "Look!" he cried. "Look at the ring on her finger! It is 1,000 years old if it is a day." The ring in question was a finely carved piece of jade, and Jim admitted that it was a remarkable treasure. As they were passing into the next cave, Gilbert exclaimed, "I have dropped my fountain pen. Don't trouble to come back with me. I have my own torch and I will soon find it." Jim and the gypsy waited for him to return. He was only gone for a few moments, and when he rejoined them he had the pen in his hand. They turned to go on their way when, suddenly, there was a rumble like distant thunder. Iago stopped at once. "It is better that we return," he cried. "The guardians are angry. Perhaps they do not like Gorgios to walk through the caves of the dead." Without waiting for any comment, he hurried them back to the entrance, and as they were passing out into the sunlight, Jim, for one horrified moment, thought that the body of the guardian on the right-hand side of the door moved as they passed. He dismissed the idea at once, thinking it was only a trick of the light. 2 days later, on the train from Pau to San Sebastian, Gilbert unwrapped something from his handkerchief and held it out to Jim. It was the dried finger of a woman, the 3rd finger of her right hand, and on it was a great jade ring. "It was too wonderful to leave behind," he explained, "and when I was trying to pull it off, the finger broke away, so I had to bring it too." Jim was annoyed, very annoyed. Not only was such a theft an outrage after the hospitality they had enjoyed, but it was also courting disaster at the hands of those awful guardians of the dead. Gilbert laughed at his fears. "They will never miss one ring from such a collection," he said, "and if there is any truth in their tales of vengeance, the curse will fall upon me, not upon you. I am willing to risk anything for such a treasure." In vain Jim begged his friend to return to the city of caves and restore the finger and the ring to their rightful place. Gilbert persisted in retaining his treasure, and relations were rather strained when they boarded the boat at San Sebastian. It was Jim who noticed them first. 2 tall men wrapped in black cloaks who stood together in the prow of the vessel. Their faces were dark and unfriendly, but there was something familiar about them, and he felt vaguely disturbed. "Who are those men who stand together at the end of the boat?" he asked the steward. The man looked where indicated, and then gave Jim a suspicious glance. "What men, sir?" he inquired. "There are no men there that I can see." This incident only increased the young Englishman's dismay, and he duly reported it to Gilbert. "Why get worried about 2 Dago?" that gentleman laughed. "They are probably a couple of priests going over to England for a few days' holiday." Jim did not see the men again until they had landed at Southampton, and then in the dusk he thought he saw them following along the street. The friends had already decided to put up at a little inn in the centre of the town and go on to London in the morning. They booked 2 adjoining rooms, and Jim went to his to unpack. Having unearthed his pyjamas and shaving tackle, he went over to the window and stood gazing down into the street. Suddenly the 2 foreigners appeared from nowhere and entered the house. Jim hurried downstairs, but there was no sign of any new arrivals in the hall, and the reception clerk looked blank when he asked her if 2 gentlemen had just entered the building. "No, sir," she said. "I have been here all the time, and no one could have come through the door without me seeing him." Jim felt that something uncanny was taking place, but a strong whiskey and soda soothed his nerves, and he and Gilbert ate quite a good dinner. Afterwards they played a game of billiards and were in bed before midnight. Sleep was slow in coming to Jim, but at last he dozed off. Almost immediately, so it seemed, he was awake again with all his senses alert. Somebody was knocking at the door of the next room. He heard Gilbert jump out of bed and unlock the door. Then he heard a scream and the door closed again. For some seconds he lay there unable to move, and then with a great effort he sprang up and went into the corridor. The door of Gilbert's room was closed, but he could hear voices murmuring within. He turned the handle gently, only to find that the door was locked. By pressing his ear to the keyhole, Jim could just make out the voices inside. They were chanting something in dull, monotonous tones, and the language they were using was Romany. It was evidently some ancient form, but he could just understand it, and his hair stood on end as he caught the drift of the words. "You have broken the sacred trust," the voices chanted. "You have violated the tombs of the great ones. You have disturbed the repose of those who sleep until they are reborn. We, the guardians of the dead, ordain your punishment. You shall be an outcast, a witless thing, knowing neither friend nor enemy, remembering only the faces of those who have been dead 1,000 years. Another scream, this time one of sheer agony and terror, resounded through the house. Jim heard footsteps on the stairs and was relieved when the landlord joined him. The man had a master key, but he could not use it as a key was still in the lock on the other side. Together they charged the door, and after 1 or 2 attempts, the lock splintered. "Gilbert!" yelled Jim as he staggered into the room. At first he thought the place was empty, but a figure rose from the floor and came shambling towards him. Saliva trickled down its chin, and its eyes were the dull, witless eyes of an idiot. Jim gazed with horror at the lunatic who had been his friend, clawing the air with trembling fingers and murmuring all the while, "The guardians of the dead! The guardians of the dead!" Whilst the poor idiot, who so recently had been gay, carefree Gilbert Brown, was being taken to the nearest asylum, Jim made further inquiries about the 2 foreigners. No such men had been seen in or near the hotel. He also went through his friend's baggage, but there was no trace of the finger with the jade ring. Gilbert was certified as insane, and within 3 months he died a raving lunatic. Last year, drawn by some irresistible force, Jim Newman revisited the Pyrenees and the city of caves. Old Manuel, who was still alive and hearty, gave him a cordial welcome and seemed to be quite ignorant of the manner in which his hospitality had been abused by the unfortunate Gilbert. On the last day of Jim's stay, he willingly gave permission for him to revisit the caves of the dead. Iago once more acted as guide. The guardians were in their accustomed places, and on carefully examining their features, Jim convinced himself of what he had suspected all along. These dead men were the strangers who had followed Gilbert and himself back to England. In the second cave, Jim paused before the mummy of the 8th Queen. Both her hands were perfect, and on the 3rd finger of the right hand glowed the jade ring. The end. And that was Guardians of the Dead by Frederick Cowles. There is something wonderfully traditional about this story. Cowles gives us one of the great recurring themes of the classic supernatural tale, the intelligent, supposedly rational man who is given a perfectly clear warning and decides that it cannot possibly apply to him. Gilbert's offence is particularly unpleasant because it isn't committed through ignorance. He has been welcomed into this strange community, shown something sacred and extraordinary, and specifically warned against interfering with it. Yet the sight of one valuable object is enough to overcome both gratitude and common sense. And Cowles makes the consequences all the more effective by refusing to explain precisely what the guardians are. Are those ancient figures truly dead? Are they supernatural entities capable of assuming physical form? Or is there something about this forgotten race and its beliefs that lies beyond ordinary human understanding? The final return to the caves provides the answer without really explaining anything at all. The guardians are once again sitting where they have sat for centuries. The Queen's hand is whole again. The jade ring has returned to her finger. Everything is exactly as it should be, except of course for Gilbert. There is more than a touch of M.R. James in the underlying principle. Leave ancient things alone. Some doors were closed for a reason. Some resting places are not museums, and possession of a curious mind does not necessarily confer the right to disturb whatever happens to be on the other side. Cowles may be rather more direct than James, but the image he leaves us with is excellent. Those silent kings and queens sitting eternally in their dark recesses, apparently dead, while their guardians wait nearby. And perhaps the most uncomfortable thought is that the guardians did not merely pursue Gilbert, they followed him all the way home. Thank you, as always, for listening. This has been Christopher Halton for Haunted Tales of Darkness. Until our next journey into the strange and supernatural, good night.